There is a moment in every relationship that does not announce itself with conflict or closure, but with a quiet internal shift. A moment when love stops reaching and starts withdrawing, when effort becomes heavy and hope begins to thin. This is often the moment no one notices until it has already passed. And for a narcissist, this moment is especially dangerous because it arrives without confrontation, without negotiation, and without warning. One day, the person who once centered them emotionally is simply no longer there in the same way. Not angry, not pleading, not explaining, just gone in presence, even if not in proximity. This is not abandonment in the dramatic sense. This is the withdrawal of genuine love. And it is here in this silent turning point that the narcissist begins to change, not because they want to, but because something essential has been removed. The moment a narcissist realizes the loss is permanent and not performative is deeply destabilizing because it removes the illusion that distance can be reversed with a gesture, charm, or crisis. For a narcissist, separation is often experienced as a pause rather than an ending because they rely on the belief that people remain emotionally available even when mistreated. They assume love waits, that attachment lingers, and that access can be restored whenever they choose. At first, they interpret silence as strategy, yours or theirs, but not as finality. What changes everything is the recognition that no reaction is coming, no emotional echo, no reopening of the door. This realization is not immediate because narcissists are oriented toward control rather than connection. They expect protest, explanation, or emotional negotiation because these responses reassure them of their importance. When none of that arrives, it creates a psychological rupture. The loss becomes real when they see you no longer orienting your life around their presence, when your absence is calm rather than dramatic, and when there is no urgency to re engage. This is when permanence sets in, not as grief, but as threat. The narcissist experiences this as a sudden drop in power because permanence means they can no longer reset the dynamic. They cannot rewrite the moment or reassert dominance. What they lost is not just a person, but the certainty that they mattered in a way that guaranteed return. This triggers anxiety, confusion, and agitation because permanence confronts them with something they avoid: responsibility. They begin to review interactions not with empathy but with calculation, searching for the point where control slipped away. The realization that the bond is truly broken forces them to face a rare truth that some losses do not respond to manipulation. There is often disbelief followed by irritation because finality contradicts their internal narrative of exceptionality. They are not accustomed to being the one left behind without leverage. This moment also exposes the difference between attention and attachment. They may still receive validation elsewhere, but it lacks familiarity, depth, and history. The love they lost had endurance and tolerance qualities that cannot be quickly replaced. Permanence removes the option of repair without accountability, and accountability is something they are not emotionally equipped to offer. As a result, they oscillate between denial, minimization, and internal rage, not always directed at you, but at the discomfort of being unchosen without recourse. The loss becomes performative only when they can reframe it publicly, but internally it remains unresolved because it confronts them with an ending they did not orchestrate and cannot undo. The loss of genuine emotional supply is fundamentally different from the loss of control, and a narcissist feels this distinction long before they can articulate it. Control is familiar territory. It is about dominance, predictability, and ensuring the other person remains responsive. Emotional supply, on the other hand, is the steady stream of admiration, affirmation, patience, and emotional labor that nourishes their fragile self image. When someone who truly loved them leaves, they do not simply lose influence over that person, they lose a source of emotional regulation that operated quietly in the background. True love does not just admire, it stabilizes, it absorbs emotional volatility, excuses inconsistency, and offers reassurance without being asked. This kind of supply allows the narcissist to function without confronting their inner emptiness. At first, they focus on regaining control because that is what they understand. They may test boundaries, provoke reactions, or attempt to reinsert themselves into your emotional field. These behaviors are not about love, but about restoring a sense of power. When those attempts fail and no response comes, the narcissist begins to feel a deeper kind of deprivation. Control can be substituted, emotional supply cannot. They can dominate others, manipulate new connections, or gather attention, but it lacks the intimacy and history that once made them feel secure. The realization sets in that while control gives them leverage, it does not give them grounding. Without genuine emotional supply, their inner state becomes unstable. Mood swings intensify, irritability increases, and a sense of restlessness emerges. They may feel bored even when surrounded by people because admiration without attachment feels hollow. This is when the loss becomes personal rather than strategic. The person who loved them offered attunement, a kind of emotional mirroring that required no performance. Losing that creates a void that cannot be filled with surface level validation. They may chase attention compulsively or escalate behaviors to provoke reactions because any emotional response feels better than none. Yet, even when control is momentarily restored through manipulation, it does not soothe the deeper wound. The absence of genuine emotional supply forces them to confront how dependent they were on someone else to feel real. This dependency is deeply threatening to their self image, so it is often disavowed or externalized as anger or contempt. They may tell themselves the person was weak or replaceable, but internally the nervous system registers the loss as dysregulation. What they truly mourn is not the relationship, but the emotional steadiness it provided. Control offered structure, but love offered containment. When love leaves, control becomes frantic and unsatisfying because it no longer rests on connection. This is why the loss lingers not as longing but as chronic internal unrest that cannot be resolved through power alone. When shame replaces grandiosity, the narcissist enters a psychological state they are poorly equipped to tolerate because grandiosity has always functioned as armor. It is the inflated self image that keeps vulnerability at bay and protects against feelings of inadequacy. When someone who truly loved them leaves, especially without drama, pleading, or return, that armor begins to weaken. The admiration that once reflected their specialness is gone, and what remains is an unfiltered encounter with the self. Shame emerges not as remorse for harm caused, but as an internal collapse of superiority. It is the realization that they were not enough to keep someone who offered consistent love without conditions. This is profoundly destabilizing because narcissists rely on the belief that others are lucky to have access to them. Losing someone who did not need to leave but chose to leave punctures that belief. Shame is experienced in the body as agitation, irritability, and a sense of exposure. They may feel suddenly small, unimportant, or unseen, which are sensations they have spent their lives avoiding. Unlike guilt, which invites repair, shame triggers defensiveness. Rather than turning inward with curiosity, they turn outward with blame, projection, or contempt. They may reinterpret the relationship to protect their ego, convincing themselves that the love they lost was flawed, excessive, or unworthy. This reframing is an attempt to escape the unbearable feeling that they were seen and still not chosen. Shame also disrupts their narrative of control. Grandiosity tells them they are exceptional and therefore exempt from consequences. Shame introduces the idea that actions have impact and that people can leave even when the narcissist does not authorize the ending. This creates internal conflict because accepting shame would require acknowledging limitation, vulnerability, and dependency. Instead, they often oscillate between moments of self-doubt and sudden returns to arrogance. These swings are not growth but survival strategies as the psyche attempts to stabilize itself. The absence of true love removes the buffer that once softened their inner experience. Without someone consistently affirming them, they are left alone with the parts of themselves they disavow. Shame lingers beneath the surface, influencing behavior in subtle ways, such as increased sensitivity to criticism, heightened reactivity, or an intensified need for validation. They may seek admiration more aggressively, yet feel less satisfied by it. Grandiosity once felt expansive, now it feels brittle. Shame narrows their emotional range, making them more rigid and defensive. What makes this shift particularly painful is that shame is relational. It arises in the context of being seen by someone who mattered. The narcissist may never consciously name this shame, but it shapes their internal world quietly, eroding the certainty they once relied on and leaving behind an unresolved tension between who they pretend to be and who they fear they are. The collapse of the false self begins quietly and internally, long before it is visible to anyone else. The false self is the carefully constructed identity the narcissist presents to the world, confident, admired, unbothered, and superior. It is not simply an image, but a psychological structure that protects them from early wounds, inadequacy, and unmet needs. As long as admiration flows, this structure remains intact. When admiration no longer returns, especially from someone who once offered unconditional love, the false self loses its reinforcement. The person who loved them did not just admire them, they believed in them and reflected back a sense of worth that felt stabilizing. When that reflection disappears, the narcissist is left without the external confirmation that keeps the false self alive. At first, they attempt to maintain the performance by seeking new audiences, new validation, and new mirrors. But something has shifted. The admiration feels thinner, less nourishing because it lacks history and emotional depth. The false self requires continuity, not novelty. Without it, cracks begin to form. They may experience moments of emptiness, boredom, or disorientation where the familiar sense of importance fails to arrive. These moments are frightening because beneath the false self, there is no cohesive identity, only fragments of unmet need and suppressed vulnerability. The collapse does not mean insight or humility. It means destabilization. Without admiration, the narcissist struggles to regulate emotion and self-worth. They may feel suddenly exposed as if the performance no longer holds. This exposure often leads to increased defensiveness, rigidity, or withdrawal. They may double down on grandiosity or detach emotionally to avoid confronting the void beneath. The loss of someone who truly loved them accelerates this collapse because that love once acted as an emotional anchor. It allowed them to feel secure without questioning who they were. When it is gone, the false self must work harder, and in doing so, reveals its fragility. The narcissist may feel unseen even when surrounded by people because none of them mirror the specific version of self that once felt real. This creates a sense of unreality, a feeling that life has lost texture or meaning. They may become more controlling or more disengaged. Both are attempts to regain internal coherence. The false self collapses not all at once, but in moments where admiration fails to soothe and validation fails to stabilize. These moments accumulate, creating chronic inner tension. What remains underneath is not a fully formed, authentic self, but an unresolved emotional landscape that was never developed. The narcissist is left oscillating between performance and withdrawal, unable to fully inhabit either. The collapse is painful not because it leads to growth, but because it removes the illusion that the self they presented was sustainable without constant external reinforcement. Without that reinforcement, the false self cannot survive, and the absence is felt as a loss of identity rather than a loss of relationship. Regret without accountability and longing without repair define the emotional aftermath for a narcissist who has lost someone who truly loved them. Regret appears first, but it is not oriented toward the other person. It is self-focused, rooted in the discomfort of loss rather than the recognition of harm. They regret the outcome, not the behavior that led to it. This distinction matters because accountability requires the capacity to hold responsibility without collapsing into shame. For a narcissist, shame is intolerable, so regret remains superficial and defensive. They may think about what they lost, how life felt easier when that person was present, how they were supported, admired, or emotionally carried. Reflection is often nostalgic but not reflective. It does not include curiosity about the other person's experience. Instead, it centers on the narcissist's internal state and what is now missing. Longing follows regret, but it too is constrained. They long for the feeling of being loved rather than for the person as a separate emotional reality. This longing can be intense, especially during moments of stress, loneliness, or perceived failure, because true love once functioned as emotional regulation. Yet longing without repair creates frustration because the narcissist does not possess the tools required to rebuild what was broken. Repair requires empathy, consistency, and humility, qualities that threaten their self-structure. As a result, the longing remains unexpressed or is expressed indirectly through hoovering nostalgia or symbolic gestures that avoid real vulnerability. They may fantasize about reconnection without imagining the changes required to sustain it. This creates an internal loop where desire resurfaces but action stalls. The narcissist may tell themselves it is too late or that the other person should reach out first. This preserves their sense of superiority while allowing longing to exist without risking rejection. Regret without accountability also allows them to rewrite the narrative. They can frame the relationship as mutually flawed or situationally doomed, which absolves them of responsibility. This protects the ego but prevents integration. Without accountability, there is no learning, only repetition. Longing without repair becomes chronic because the emotional need remains unmet. They may seek substitutes, new relationships, admiration, or distractions, but none address the unresolved loss. This creates a low-grade dissatisfaction that lingers beneath their interactions. They are haunted not by guilt, but by an unfulfilled emotional dependency they cannot name. The absence of repair means the relationship remains frozen in their mind, idealized and unresolved. They may oscillate between devaluing the person and romanticizing the bond. Both are defenses against facing their own limitations. Regret and longing coexist, but never evolve into growth because growth would require acknowledging how their behavior contributed to the loss. Without that acknowledgement, the narcissist remains emotionally stuck, replaying the loss internally while presenting indifference externally, caught between desire and defensiveness, unable to move forward or truly let go. The absence of unconditional love subtly but profoundly rewires the narcissist's inner narrative because it removes a stabilizing emotional reference point they depended on without fully recognizing it. Unconditional love offered consistency, acceptance, and emotional containment without requiring performance. It allowed the narcissist to feel grounded even while avoiding vulnerability or self-examination. When that love disappears, the internal story they tell themselves about who they are and how relationships function begins to fracture. At first, the absence is externalized as loss or injustice, but over time, it becomes internalized as disorientation. Their usual narrative of being self-sufficient, superior, or unaffected no longer aligns with their lived emotional experience. They may feel unsettled without understanding why. Unconditional love once softened the edges of their inner world. It absorbed mood shifts, tolerated inconsistency, and provided reassurance that they mattered even when they failed to show up emotionally. Without it, the narcissist is forced to confront emotional states they previously outsourced. Anxiety, insecurity, and emptiness become more frequent because there is no longer someone buffering them from discomfort. This alters their inner dialogue. Where there was once certainty, there is now questioning. Where there was entitlement, there is now unease. They may not consciously link this to the loss, but their nervous system registers the absence. The internal narrative shifts from invulnerability to vigilance. They become more preoccupied with how they are perceived, more reactive to perceived rejection, and more sensitive to emotional withdrawal. Unconditional love allowed them to believe relationships were stable, regardless of their behavior. Its absence teaches a different lesson, one they resist but cannot fully escape. The lesson is that connection requires reciprocity and that people leave when emotional needs go unmet. This realization is not integrated, but it influences behavior indirectly. They may become more guarded or more controlling, attempting to prevent future losses. Alternatively, they may disengage emotionally, avoiding closeness altogether to protect themselves from exposure. The inner narrative becomes more fragmented, oscillating between longing for closeness and fear of dependence. Unconditional love once masked their emotional deficits by compensating for them. Without it, these deficits become more visible internally, even if they remain hidden externally. They may experience a quiet grief not for the person, but for the sense of emotional safety they no longer have access to. This grief reshapes their understanding of intimacy, making it feel riskier and less reliable. Over time, the absence of unconditional love reinforces a worldview where connection is conditional, transactional, or fragile. This worldview is a defense against vulnerability, but it also deepens their isolation. The inner narrative no longer includes the possibility of being loved without performance. Instead, it is rewritten around control, distance, and self-preservation, leaving them emotionally poorer but psychologically defended against the pain of loss. In the end, what changes a narcissist is not the loss itself, but what the loss exposes. When someone who truly loved them is gone, the strategies that once protected them begin to fail. Control no longer restores connection, admiration no longer soothes the inner unrest, and grandiosity no longer silences shame.